Okay, I think we can get started then. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are all connecting from today. And welcome. My name is Ann Lang. I'm the Executive Director of PHAP, that's short for the International Association of Professionals in Humanitarian Assistance and Protection. I am delighted to be serving as your co-host today for this webinar entitled Risky Business, Reframing the Fundamentals of Risk Management for Humanitarians, organized in partnership between PHAP and ICVA. And I'm very pleased to introduce as my co-host today Jeremy Rempel from ICVA, who serves there as Head of Humanitarian Financing. Welcome, Jeremy.
Greetings, Ingrid, and everyone online. Thanks for the introduction. And pleasure to co-host today.
Terrific, thanks. So before starting the substance of the session, I will briefly explain a few technical aspects of this interactive platform for those of you who are less familiar with it so that we can all get the most out of this hour and a half. First, and very importantly, how to submit questions. If you have questions for our speakers at any time during the session, please submit them using the Ask a Question box in the lower right-hand corner of your screen. And note that if you'd like to ask your question anonymously, you should mention this when submitting it. Otherwise, we will most likely mention your first name when posing your question to a speaker. Next, you'll be seeing snap polls throughout the session. These are to gauge your views or experience on the issues being discussed. You should now see two test polls displayed as an example. Just click on a response, or for free text polls, as on the right-hand side, click on the text box, enter the response, and click Submit. And note that for the polls, including both the multiple choice and free text polls, all of your answers are fully anonymous. Finally, in case you encounter any technical problems with the platform during the event, in particular if you feel that your connection is a bit weak, you're having long delays or gaps in the audio, you may wish to jump over to one of our backup live streaming options. We have both a video and also an audio-only live streaming option. These are designed for lower bandwidth connections. They do use lower bandwidth, but they do not allow for the same degree of interactivity with the chat, the Q&A, the polls, and so on. So they really are meant to be used as a backup. To connect to them, just follow the links that you see now on your screen. And if you find that later in the event you need to jump over to one of the backup live streams, just mention that in the chat, and my colleague will be happy to share those links once again in the chat so you can easily move over if you need to. So with that, we'll turn to the substance of today's event. We're going to be starting out with a brief introduction to the concept of risk management and humanitarian action, and then looking at how it's being implemented, as an example, by World Vision in Somalia. We'll then be exploring the overall challenges with current approaches and discussing possible solutions and ways forward for improving risk management in humanitarian action. And Jeremy, an important point, this is the starting point, as we understand, of an ICVA briefing series on risk management. Could you start us off by saying a few words about this?
Yes, thanks very much, Ingrid. And as you pointed out, this is a starting point in a longer series that we're looking at between now and March 2020, when we have our next ICVA annual conference. So today is intended to be a kickoff launch webinar. We'll have the opportunity to talk through some of the fundamentals and set the stage. Over the next few months, we have a briefing series that will be released in paper. Actually, our first installment on organizational culture and a deeper dive into some of the topics we're talking about today is in final draft and ready for publication next week. So we can look for that to be released via the ICVA website and our mailing list. So first installment next week. And you see some of the different topics we're intending to cover in that briefing series around culture, risk appetite tolerance, security risk, and using the tools. So going back to how we use risk management tools better. This is a starting point. I think along the way we'll have the opportunity to adjust, perhaps do some more web engagement, but this gives you an idea of the plan laid out. And that builds towards the ICVA 2020 annual conference, where this year there's a theme around protecting principled humanitarian action and honest conversation on risk. So for the next few months between now and March, you can see we're intending to have a little bit of a deeper dive into the subject of risk management. And very quickly along with that, just to share a few points on the purpose of the series, I noticed in the registration poll, I don't think we had anybody come online yet that claimed to be an expert in risk. That's okay. We had a lot of people say they were somewhat familiar or knew quite a bit, some less familiar. But as you can see, the purpose of this series is not to tailor just towards the needs of the experts. I think really we want to make the discussion more accessible to practitioners and decision makers. So those who may not be tasked specifically to do risk, this is for you, to examine some of the core risk management issues unique to humanitarian space. So risk management is a broad discipline. How is it linked specifically to us working in humanitarian space? And then finally, help to ensure that existing tools and lessons are identified and understood. As I said, there are a lot of tools out there around risk management, but how can we make sure that those are understood and applied appropriately to humanitarian space? I think finally, again, we do want to avoid duplication and complement other efforts. I think you'll see later today in the presentation, there's a lot of ongoing work. So part of the challenge is to ensure that we're pulling together toward the common goal, not just duplicating or overlapping each other. So that gives you a brief introduction to the series and some of why we're undertaking this effort.
Perfect, Jeremy. Thanks so much, and huge thanks to you and your colleagues for putting together what looks to be a really useful and much-needed series. And I think we see a great evidence of that need and interest already today for the kickoff. To everyone who's joined online, and also those of you listening in, I know there are a number of people over on the backup live stream. I encourage you as much as you can to engage in the chat, to provide your views on risk management, and of course to submit your questions throughout the event. We'll get to as many of them as we can during this hour and a half, but as you can see, with this just being the start of a series, there are going to be a lot of opportunities to address the questions that you have now over the coming months. So please do bring those in, and I'm sure that will help to inspire what's coming down the pipeline from ICVA. Now, before turning back to Jeremy for introducing the basics of risk management and humanitarian action, I'd like now to introduce our guest speaker, Patroba Otieno. Patroba Otieno is a certified public accountant of Kenya with 18 years of experience. He's been working with World Vision International Somalia program since 2013 as the risk and financial specialist. Patroba has 11 years of experience in the humanitarian sector, 4 with CARE International in Kenya and 7 with World Vision Somalia program. His main area of expertise is in risk and strategic financial management for decision making. Before that, he worked for 3 years as senior auditor in a medium-sized audit firm, and among his major achievements, we see setting up financial management systems in fragile contexts, and more recently setting up the Enterprise Risk Management, ERM, system for World Vision Somalia to ISO 31000 standards. Patroba, it's great to have you with us. Thank you so much for joining today's events, and welcome. I think we've unmuted you so we can so you can jump in and say hello. Also a good chance to double check the audio.
Hello, everyone. It's nice to be in this platform, and I'm glad to join you as a presenter.
Excellent, and a big welcome to you, Patroba. Thanks again for being with us. Now, back to you, Jeremy. So to get us all starting on the same page, I'll turn to you first for an overview of the fundamentals of risk management as it relates to the humanitarian sector. Over to Jeremy.
Great. Thanks, Ingrid, and welcome, Patroba, as well. So to start the conversation, I wanted to take just a moment to frame a few of the basics to move forward. And I think, again, knowing that we have a range of expertise and experience in the room, this may be new to some and not new to others, but I think helpful to make sure we start all on the same page. So first, I think important to touch upon a couple of definitions. We have actually a large range of terms that are important to understand when we get into some of the details of risk and risk management. But at the very high level, we have two definitions I think are important to look at. And these both are coming from the ISO 31000 standard, and that's the International Standards Organization 31000 standard, which is focused on risk management and is seen as one of the common, probably the main common global standard in the area of risk management. So for risk, ISO defines it as the effect of uncertainty on an organization's objectives. That's a pretty broad definition. I think important to note that that current definition does not always suggest that risk is negative. It could be positive or negative. It's more based on uncertainty. In practice, however, I think we all understand when we talk about risk, we tend to focus on the negative impacts, and that's normally where we go to, but it is generally defined as uncertainty on objectives. Risk management then is defined as the coordinated activities to direct and control an organization with regard to risk. So risk management is then the whole body of processes, guidelines, tools, policies, procedures that are put in place when an organization is seeking to handle risk. Normally, we might look at this as the controls. That's a common term we see as well, the ways in which we put controls or other measures in place to deal with risk. So good to keep those two common definitions in mind. I think you'll see both of those terms used throughout the discussion today, so good that we have a common understanding. Now, to frame the problem, I think, again, this is somewhat basic to those of us that have worked in the humanitarian space for some time, but I think important to highlight. Humanitarian space is inherently high risk. By the nature of our work, we already know we're working in higher risk environments. And I think this is evidence when you look at some of the guiding imperatives, codes of conduct, standards around the humanitarian space. So just a few examples on the screen coming from ICRC, Code of Conduct, around our motivation to respond to disaster and alleviate suffering. See from the Humanitarian Charter, we have the Humanitarian Imperative. That action should be taken to prevent or alleviate human suffering arising out of disaster, and that nothing should override this principle. And from the humanitarian principles, we have humanity, the first one around human suffering must be addressed wherever it is found. So I think we already know from a starting point that as humanitarians, we're working in potentially high-risk places. And that in part defines the culture that we have as humanitarians, that we have a high degree of risk acceptance as part of our core identity. We already know from the start that we're seeking to work in places that will be higher risk. So I wanted to take a minute to touch upon a few of the current drivers of the discussion on risk in the humanitarian space. And I should note that these can change over time, but I think in the current landscape, the current discussion, there's a few key issues that really do drive some of the discussions that we're having around risk management and risk in general. First is an area around donor contracts and conditions. So I think we see an increasing donor demand for accountability, accompanied with a high transfer of risk to partners. So from the NGO perspective, when we're signing agreements with donors, whether it's government or intermediary UN partners, frequently we're seeing an increased demand for accountability as to how the money is used, what systems are in place, and frequently we take on a very high level of responsibility for whether we have problems or issues or what goes wrong with that funding. And this can also lead to a transfer of risk throughout the system to our national partners as well, who may or may not have appropriate resources to manage risk well. We'll come back to that point later on in the presentation. I think a second big driver currently is staff care and security. This topic has come up in a number of environments recently, and knowing the inherent context in which we work as humanitarians, issues of security, of how we care for staff are certainly very important. I think we've seen certainly an increasing pressure to work in high-risk environments, fragile contexts, and that's not always accompanied with resources to go along to care fully for staff and provide security. And I'd say, again, this can be a critical issue for national partners where those resources can be even more scarce. Finally, I just wanted to touch on counterterror measures. I think this is another area where we see increasing restrictions coming from donors, not just on listed groups or individuals, but also with geographic engagement and restrictions on geographically where humanitarians can work. There can be frequently a gap between the staff signing agreements with donors and knowledge of field practice. In many cases, those who sign agreements with donors do not necessarily have first-hand knowledge of capability that exists among field staff to manage risk, which can lead to a gap in understanding. And with some donors in particular, there can be high levels of accountability required over long periods of time, plus or minus 10 years when you sign an agreement for some donors, saying that you're validating that for the past 10 years you've not worked with organizations or individuals who might be on a watch list. And that goes beyond some of the timeframes that are typically involved in normal accounting practice. So some big emerging issues that certainly drive some of the need to have a conversation on risk and risk management. I say et cetera there because these are largely global examples. The specific drivers for risk management can change significantly depending on your context and location. One caution to go along with these points as well, I think, as we'll get to in our discussion today, these current issues can be great motivators to push us forward to change to improve our risk management practices, but I think also good to remember that regardless of our context or the issues that we're facing, good risk management practice is a basic element of a well-functioning organization. And when we do that better, we put ourselves in a better place to meet the needs of the people that, as an NGO, for example, we exist to serve. So good to have drivers and issues to respond to, but I think important to remember that this implementation of risk management in an organization is part of a good basic practice. And finally, I want to take a moment to touch upon zero tolerance risk. I think this is another area that is not necessarily dealing with a specific issue. It's more of a cross-cutting trends that we see across issues where there's increasing use of language around zero tolerance. This comes up in numerous occasions in donor agreements and language, but I think we see language suggesting zero tolerance for incidents of different various risks around fraud, corruption, mismanagement, etc. are increasingly prevalent in the humanitarian system, particularly in agreements. And this can be problematic when we talk about zero tolerance of incidents. This could lead us to focus on incidents or reducing incidents to zero without sufficient attention to whether we have the appropriate controls in place to handle them when they inevitably do happen. I think all of us working in humanitarian space understand that incidents will happen. So we're guaranteed to have issue there. So it's important that we move a little beyond that and recall that focusing on good risk management does not involve reducing risks to zero. It's focused on having the appropriate tools, controls, processes in place to ensure that we're comfortable managing the levels of risk that we do face. And just a couple of points on what happens. I think this is part of the problem that we face when we have too much of an unrealistic zero tolerance approach is to add some stresses to the humanitarian system. One, certainly there's an increased stress because of this type of approach to transfer risk to partners without accepting and managing an appropriate level of risk internally. So when we have language around zero tolerance, we're suggesting that we're continuing to pass on 100% of risk further on to partners. And this is not just true between donors and NGOs, but can happen as well between larger NGO partners and those partners that we work with in the field. So the end result can be a significant level of risk transferred towards local partners that tend to have increasingly fewer resources available to manage that risk. I think so a big issue to be considered around how we can ensure there's an appropriate focus not just on incidents but on managing risk appropriately, and also that we have appropriate acceptance and willingness to manage risk at different points in the humanitarian chain of work. Right. Let me pause there with the introduction and turn it back over to you.
Okay, terrific. Thanks a lot, Jeremy. And I could see that you really struck a chord with those last points you were making regarding zero risk tolerance. There were, it was a large majority of respondents, more than 70%, saying in our SNAP poll there that they had themselves encountered zero tolerance risk, in their work. So that's certainly an important challenge, I think, to discuss more. Now, I would like to soon move over to Patroba to look at the experience of World Vision Somalia. But before doing that, we've actually received a large number of questions from participants about some of the basic concepts and terms related to risk management, and it would be good to clear those up first, I think, before we move on. So, so a series of questions for you then, Jeremy. So first of all, a number of participants, including Norwin in Myanmar and Amal in Jordan, have asked about what we mean with risk as a technical term in humanitarian action. What are some typical examples, concrete examples, of the things that would be labeled a, quote, risk by someone working in risk management in a humanitarian organization? Over to you, Jeremy.
Yes, thanks for that. I think that's a great question as well. We heard early on I shared some of the high-level definitions of risk and risk management. I think within that, though, you do have a number of categories. These can be quite varied. I think later on today you'll see some links to additional materials where you can go into detail. But to give you some examples in the humanitarian space, I think obviously around security, staff care, we see a risk category there that can involve potential for violence, crime, danger to staff safety, etc. We have another big category around fiduciary risk that typically covers things like incidents of corruption, fraud, theft of supplies, diversion of supplies. We have reputational risk. It can be damage to reputation. I think increasing issues with data risk, so information risk when it comes to personal data, electronic data we collect for lists of people in need and how safe and secure that information is. Obviously legal and compliance risks when it comes to various laws and regulations. Operational risk when it comes to different capacity required to do monitoring and evaluation well, to follow through on some of our operational commitments. So there really is a broad range of risk that can be different topics that can be relevant to humanitarians. Those are a few examples of how we typically classify them.
Thanks, Jeremy. That's really helpful. And I see that Patroba would like to come in on this as well. I'm going to jump over to Patroba now also on this question of what are risks. Over to you, Patroba.
Excellent.
Yeah, just to add on to what Jeremy has said, I think risk in organizational context is usually defined as anything that can impact the fulfillment of corporate objectives. So if you use that simple definition, for instance, that's the one we use in Somalia, it will really be helpful in the humanitarian action point of view. And when it comes to categorization, there are so many varied ways of doing it by different people. For instance, the Institute of Risk Management puts risks into 4 categories. There's a compliance risk, which deals with the statutory requirements or mandatory requirements or regulations. There may even be donor requirements, anything to do with compliance. Then we have hazard risk, which the type that only have negative outcomes, things like fire, accident, and so forth. And then we have opportunity risks. These are like risks that risks where a positive return is expected. So there are many varied ways, but I think we should actually have a working definition in terms of the organization.
Thanks so much for that, Patroba. So moving to the next question then, and I'm going to toss this back to Jeremy. We have actually two questions that are similar. So one coming from Nicholas in Jordan and another from Volcana in Bulgaria, pointing out that there's often a lot of confusion among people who mix up risk management and risk mitigation. Risk mitigation being just one strategy of risk management. I wonder, Jeremy, would you be able to briefly explain the difference between risk management and risk mitigation, and also mention the other three common risk management strategies and what those mean?
Yes, no problem. I think this is a good question as well, and I think something key to remember in the definition of risk management, as we shared in the beginning, is it's the overarching set of tools, policies, etc. an organization might use to address risk. So it's very high level. Risk mitigation would be a subset of that. So one of the tools used to address risk would be risk mitigation. I think an important concept to remember when distinguishing between the two is you don't manage risk down to zero, right? So if you confuse risk management and risk mitigation, that might come up as a confusion that somehow you can manage risk down to zero, which is not the case. There's really no such thing as mitigating down to zero or managing risk down to zero. So mitigation is one strategy that we use to manage risk. And I think in the question, there was an interest in some of the other common strategies. So I believe in the question it mentioned, there's a mention of risk transfer, risk avoidance, risk acceptance. There's a number of different elements that can come up as tools within the risk management frame. So certainly risk transfer, the degree to which we shift risk onto other partners or other entities. We mentioned that a little bit when I talked about donor contracts, for example, the degree to which a donor might shift risk for implementation to an organization receiving funds, and that in turn could be shifted onto other partners. Avoidance, so are we going to deal with risk or choose to operate in a way that avoids it completely? So we might change our operational approach to work in an area that is less risky. We decide there's too much risk for us to handle or accept or tolerate. And risk acceptance. I think this is obviously a big part of the humanitarian space, the degree to which we're willing to accept a certain level of risk in our work based on the context we're working with. And that's okay. Again, that suggests that we're not, in fact, managing down to zero. There's a degree to which we'll always be required to accept some risk in the work that we do as humanitarians.
Great, thanks a lot, Jeremy. Another question, Sheila in Kenya is wondering whether there is a connection between monitoring and evaluation on the one hand and risk management on the other as functions within organizations.
Yes, thank you. I really like this question actually because I think this is an element that's frequently overlooked. When we talk about risk management and get into a very technical discussion around risk, frequently we think of some of the tools such as controls for the organization more in financial terms than in terms that cut across different parts of operations. I spent years in my previous life working on operations audits, and I think there should be a very strong connection between some of what we look at in our M&E framework and what's included in our risk management work. So when we go through the process of risk management and set up identification of risk, develop a risk register where we catalog different risks, go through the process of the risk matrix, so identifying where there are highest level of risks and the likelihood of those risks occurring, and then link those to different controls in the organization. I think when we talk about that development of controls, for example, to manage risk well, it's critical to look at our M&E system and see where there's overlap. So I would say ideally, one of the starting points when we're considering what is most important to be monitoring would be to look at our risk matrix, for example, at where we've identified key controls to manage risk, and ensure that there's some good overlap between those two. So that's actually a topic I'm interested in exploring a little more in our briefing series, but I think is a good one to be thinking of.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Next question, and we have time, I think, for a few more here. Jude, connecting today from the United States, is wondering about two terms that she often comes across, one being risk appetite and the other being risk tolerance. And she's wondering, what do these terms, what meaning do these terms have in the context of risk management in humanitarian action? Over to you, Jeremy.
Right, so this is another very good question. I think for those of you who were here at the beginning for my introduction, you might have caught that one of the outputs of our briefing series is to look specifically at this question of risk appetite versus risk tolerance. So there'll be more to come on this, but very briefly, risk appetite is normally defined as our willingness to accept risk, and risk tolerance is defined as our ability to handle risk. So there's a subtle but important distinction between those two, where appetite is willingness to handle risk or accept risk, tolerance the ability to do so, and those are not always the same. I think a frequent issue that comes up and something that we want to explore later in the briefing series is the situation that it can frequently occur, I believe, with humanitarian organizations where our appetite or our willingness to accept risk can be beyond our ability to handle it. So what happens when we're willing to accept levels of risk that our organization is not in fact prepared to handle with its different policies, processes, procedures, etc. So hopefully that helps a little bit to distinguish between the two. Again, willingness versus ability. And again, that's something that we'll explore in more depth as we go through our briefing series.
Great, thank you. We have also received a few questions, including one from Sarah in South Korea, on one of the areas where humanitarians hear the word risk mentioned probably the most often, and that is in the context of disaster risk reduction. Could you help us understand what is the relationship between risk management as an organizational function and DRR, disaster risk reduction?
Sure, and I'd be more than happy to welcome Patroba to jump in on any of these if he wants to add in from a more field perspective as well. So, good question. I think disaster risk reduction, as you say, is a common term or approach that we hear in the humanitarian space. For me, I would distinguish between the two as disaster risk reduction being part of a programmatic approach. So certainly the way we go about a good disaster risk reduction strategy, for example, might in fact include a lot of overlap with how we think about risk management, how we catalog risks, how we set up a matrix to help us prioritize where to take action. So I think certainly a lot of overlap between disaster risk reduction thinking and risk management thinking. However, an organization undertaking disaster risk reduction, that's typically more of a programmatic approach, looking at how you engage outwardly with other organizations, with the local population, with the government, in order to reduce the potential effects of impending disaster. I would distinguish that from risk management, which for an organization is a very broad, cross-cutting discipline that looks internally at a number of functions across the internal workings of an organization, how we handle risk. So that would be the main distinction for me. Disaster risk reduction, typically more of a programmatic approach, whereas the broader discipline of risk management for an organization would cut across all functions of an organization internally.
Great, thank you. One more question, Jeremy, and then I am going to jump over to Patroba for a field perspective on how this is operationalized in practice. Question from Bilal in Jordan is wondering how risk can be measured in unstable political and geopolitical situations. I think related to some of the points you were making earlier regarding the inherent risk in humanitarian action itself. Back to you, Jeremy.
Yeah, I think I'll say just two brief points here, and then I think this is a perfect one to hand over to Patroba for his expertise on this exact topic. So I think, as I shared earlier, one of the challenges in an unstable, fragile context is there will inherently be large degrees of risk. And I think maybe more so than even measuring, two challenges come to mind for me here. I think one, certain types of risks in those contexts can become really a core focus. So obviously security, staff care risk can be a critical focus in those type of situations in fragile contexts, and can in some cases overshadow the need to also consider other areas of risk. So it can be a tendency to overfocus in certain areas and then ignore others. And I think another issue can make it can be that it's harder to prioritize risk. So if you're working in incredibly high-risk environments, prioritization then can be somewhat difficult, as a larger range of different risk areas might in fact be high risk in that context. So the prioritization becomes a little bit of a challenge to use the tool as well. I think I'll stop with just those two comments, and I really would be great to hand it over to Patroba on this point.
Terrific. Thanks, Jeremy. Yes, so over to you, Patroba. Do you have something to share with us on this question of measuring risk, especially in unstable political and geopolitical situations? Over to you.
Yes, I'll start by one of the arguments by Professor John Adams, who's an expert on risk. And he says that risk management is in fact more complex than rocket science, because it deals with both what can be perceived through science and measured, and also deals with some things which cannot be measured. They're inconclusive and therefore subjective. It deals with even virtual risk. So when it comes to measuring risk, I think the best attempt to it may be coming up with a criteria. Let's say as an organization, on what you're going, the measurements you're going to use, because they really come, this is one area where the risk professionals agree that it's really subjective. So, for instance, how do you say fraud is has more rating in this case than maybe insecurity and so forth? So what we've done in World Vision Somalia is come up with a criteria that can guide us, and therefore when we are measuring the risk, we subject it to that criteria when it comes to maybe 4 functions: people, when it comes to reputation, when it comes to financial losses, and so forth. And we put in specific indicators that will qualify for.
Great, thanks a lot, Patroba. I have another question for you, actually, before we move on to your presentation. This is a question coming from Muka Rukundu, connecting from Kenya. So wondering, so you had mentioned, or it was mentioned earlier, the concept of opportunity risk. And Muka Rukundu is wondering if you can share with us any tangible example of opportunity risk from your experience. Over to you, Patroba.
Okay, we deal with a fragile context. And one of the things we've done, and the best example I can give from what we've done practically, we actually have a project in World Vision Somalia that actually deals with resilience. And most of the work they do is actually research. So this involves a lot of innovations. In a sense, these are things that practically are not expected to happen in the fragile context, but we are trying them out because there are things that involve research. We try to see out how they work. For instance, the local community deals with livestock a lot, and therefore we try new things like livestock insurance concepts, trying to develop that, working with maybe things like village savings to come up with some informal bankings that can help them. And this is where we don't have regulatory authority. So we even try to build this up, starting from the low level in the community. So those are some of the innovations that we try to come up with, and they can be termed as opportunity risks, whereby the outcome, a positive return.
Terrific. Thank you very much. It's really an excellent set of questions that have come in so far. Participants, please do keep those coming, and I hope that we'll have some more time later on in the session. But now, having completed our introduction and also gone through a number of questions for clarification, I think we're all looking forward to hearing more from you, Patroba, about how this is being implemented in practice in your context. So back to you, Patroba, and we're putting your slides up now.
Okay. Okay, thank you. I will share the World Vision Somalia experience. And by way of introduction, my name is Patroba Otieno, as well as and I am the risk prime for World Vision Somalia with the title of Risk and Financial Specialist. So moving on to the next slide. I would like to just skip over that because I think Jeremy has covered a lot on that. But what I would like, an aspect that I would like to just bring out is the difference between risk management and enterprise risk management. Risk management is probably, in the loose term, what each and every one of us does in their normal course of duty, the controls that you have, the policies that you have to follow, and so forth. But enterprise risk management is doing the same in a systemized and a structured way. So this, as we've heard from Jeremy's presentation, involves strategy, policies, and processes in risk management. Therefore, you're not just doing it in a vacuum, but within the process. So I think that was really important that I highlight that so that we discuss it within that context. Now, moving on to what we've been able to achieve as World Vision Somalia. We used to have a risk done in a very ad hoc manner. For instance, where probably donors ask for a risk register, and there we come up with one there and then and submit and so forth. So we are moving, we have actually moved from that state to what I can define as now the enterprise risk management as it should. From a solitary activity to a team activity and integrated activity where it is done in teams. It's not one person coming up with a risk register and probably submitting it to a donor and so forth. But it is a process. In fact, what we do is at the onset of every project, we have to come up with a risk register so that when we start a project, we start already knowing what risk that project portrays and the mitigation measures we have in place. So it used to be an informal and unconscious thing, but now it is intentional and embedded due to the efforts that we've had in the enterprise risk management. And nowadays we have it documented. So if anyone asks for the top 10 risks in World Vision Somalia, it's easy, and anyone is, because it's a process that involves everyone, then it's easy to just get a documentation and provide evidence that you are actually doing risk mitigation. So on to the key elements that have really been helpful to us as an office for this ERM to be as successful as the stage we are now. We have the risk strategy and appetite statement, which basically links to our strategic objectives. And then we have the people, and I can say that when I became the risk prime for World Vision Somalia in 2016, I can say that was one of the major steps in trying to have the ERM set up within World Vision Somalia. Then we have the culture, which is basically defined by the tone of the top, at the top, and the tools which involves the policies, roles and responsibility, the risk registers, and so forth. Then we have the processes. And the other thing that has really been helpful is having the risk-based internal audit. This is helpful because having done all, then we need someone to just give us that assurance that we are indeed doing what is within our framework and what we've agreed to do in terms of risk management. So this also helps to promote the culture. And then we have the data and technology, which basically provides the enablement. We can see the risk at a glance, and it makes it easier for people to interact and analyze the risks in the system. So those are the key elements that I can say have really been helpful to ensure that we as World Vision Somalia reach where we are today. So what are some of the successes that we've experienced as a result of the risk ERM establishment in World Vision Somalia? One very proud achievement is having a direct impact on the implementation rate. When I joined World Vision Somalia in 2013, we used to have an implementation rate of between 85 to 87%, and we'd accepted it as the best we can do because we are operating in an environment where security is a challenge, government interference is there in a massive way, and it's easy to just give yourself that comfort zone that this is the best we can do. But when we settle down to ERM, we ask ourselves tough questions because it's part of the process. What is the source of this risk? And then you think of the possible solutions. We actually realize that we can go further than just the 85, 87%. And for the last 3 years, we've actually had a rate of 100%. And this is important because one of our strategic imperatives is to reach, is to actually reach the most vulnerable children in the most fragile context. So if we settle for 87%, it means the percentage you're leaving may be where we actually want to target most in terms of our strategic imperatives. And therefore, this is a very great achievement. When it comes to the local partners, this area has also been an area of very great success because we put in measures through ERM that ensure that we have deliberate efforts of addressing the capacity of local partners. And you see when challenges come up, they are raised in the risk register, they are actioned and escalated accordingly, they are discussed because of the structures that you set up under ERM. Because previously someone would raise them as an issue, probably as a project officer, but there was no structure to escalate this and to have this addressed. And then there's also the active feedback mechanism. I remember us sitting in the ERM committee and addressing issues to do with the feedback mechanisms, why we're not receiving feedback, and then going to the source of those whys and so forth, and ensuring that we follow up on the action points up to when we get success on this outcome, and also on the whistleblower outline. This has been so active from trace from the time we started ERM and trace to specific risk mitigation measures we have in our risk register. So we had time when issues of corruption, even among staff, were just being reported, and the way we dealt with them as per the action point stipulated encouraged people to keep on reporting because they see there is action being taken. And this has been very helpful to help us grow and deal with some issues that we've been facing because we have the necessary feedback. Then we have success in implementation of audit recommendation, basically because the ERM structure sets the ERM committee to follow up on those audit recommendations, which in a sense have helped us to improve in terms of implementing those recommendations. So what are some of the challenges that we've been facing or that we faced, because most of them have actually been addressed with time? So when I go to the challenges, one of the major challenges that we faced initially is staff treating this as really something that is an added load to them. And the there was a feeling that, hey, because, you know, initially setting up the structures, having them work, going through the process of coming up with the risks and the mitigation, it may seem like a lot of work and like an additional work. So most of the responses we used to get is, we don't have time. Can you come in the next quarter maybe, or can we do this later? And one of the things that really helped us is, most of the things that the project staff were doing ended up coming back to the table of ERM. And I would like to maybe thank the effort by the donors, because some of them will say, hey, before you proceed with this proposal, can we see the risk assessment? And then they will come back and say, okay, we are now ready, or let us do this, and so forth. So these are there to even, to some extent, solve some of these challenges. And you realize you cannot be too busy for risk management, because it's actually what is helping you to achieve your objective. The other thing is the fear that, oh, if I report my risk, if I report fraud, then I'll be seen as a bad person, or something bad is happening in my project, and so forth. So these are some of the misconceptions that we had to address. Otherwise, it will lack, the whole thing will lack objectivity. And then the other thing is risk primes being considered as the risk owners. I had some cases where emails were being forwarded to me just because they have the term risk. And some were very legal, very technical, and it becomes difficult because someone thinks anything risk. Actually, with the right conception, then you come to realize that it is everyone's duty to handle risk in their own respective technical area, and we cannot operate in silos. Then there are other cases where we face the responses that we don't have any risk, our operations are okay, we're running smoothly. But when you subject the same project or team for evidence or assessment, what they've done or evidence, you realize that they will actually come up with risks. That they say, okay, by the way, we had overlooked this. So ERM as a way of addressing that challenge. We started off with Excel, and it was tedious, and to some extent, some staff were learning Excel at the same time as learning ERM, and this was a challenge because for some this was a put-off. Excel was not in their line of job. So we actually appreciate that we had the software, but then it comes with another challenge in that in fragile context, not all areas are accessible in terms of internet, or it is very expensive. Then we have the clan system where we operate, where the feeling on the ground, the locals, is that we have a system that is working. If there's fraud somewhere, if someone has done something, I remember a case where we had handed over a project to the locals, the community, and one of the transactions in the bank, because it was something to do with the business income and investment, and they realized, we realized that money has been removed from the account by one of the banking staff. And we tried to handle this case in the structure of ERM, but they were like, okay, we've sorted everything, the clan has sorted everything, everything is okay. And they didn't want us to follow up. So it becomes difficult to entrench and embed this ERM system in the local community. And then it takes time, because for the culture to sink in and people to become proactive and see the need and so forth, it requires a lot of training, awareness, and demonstration of this need. And lastly, I would say that lack of greater coordination among humanitarian and development workers is also a challenge, because we don't meet to share experiences that we face in different organizations. And I think to a large extent we can benefit a lot if we do that. And with that, I would like to hand it over to my host.
I have a few questions
for the next
you
session.
at this point. One is a quick follow-up from Oscar, who's wondering, what type of software are you using in World Vision Somalia?
In the whole of World Vision, we use the Risk Connect software.
Very good. Thank you.
The name is Risk Connect.
Another question. I know that Jeremy will be speaking a bit later in the webinar on resources for risk management, but I did want to pose the question to you now. For someone who wants to educate themselves in this area and maybe even move into working in the area of risk management and humanitarian action, where would you start? And how did you, Patroba, end up working as a specialist in this area?
Oh yes, I can say in terms of professional development in this area, one of the respected authorities is the Institute of Risk Management in the UK. They offer online courses, certification courses, diploma courses, and they are recognized as one of the professional bodies worldwide. And I can say that being a certified public accountant, part of my training involved having this task, doing it either to clients. As I said before, I've worked in an audit firm as an audit senior. So it has, I've had practical experience working on this, setting up due diligence systems and so forth, risk management systems from my background as an accountant. And I must say that in World Vision Somalia, when the opportunity came, because we actually saw this as a serious step, having ERM in 2013, then I was appointed as a risk prime, given my background.
Very good,
and
thank
that's
you.
How I ended up.
We also had a few
position.
participants, including Michael in Kenya and Sharon in the United States, with questions about corruption and fraud. So I wonder, could you expand a bit, Patroba, on how you are approaching issues of corruption and fraud in your risk management work in Somalia?
We have a 7-step approach on anti-corruption and fraud. And these 7 steps, I just mentioned them briefly because we do intense work on this. The first is having an internal controls review and strengthening system. We use some tools which we also administer to our partners, internal control self-assessment tools, where we have to assess their system, their internal controls, to see that there's no opportunity. They actually deal with the opportunities. You know, in Fraud Diamond, there are 4 things that really need to be in place for fraud to take place. The opportunity, there's the justification, and then there are other factors, like, let's say, the ability. If someone is in a position to do it, then they feel like they can do it. So we strengthen the internal controls to ensure that these gaps are seen. Then the tone at the top is set right. In other words, the management has set forth consistent practices when it comes to dealing with the cases. Whoever is involved and whatever level the staff is, the tone at the top is that this is really dealt with in a very tough way. And then we have a fraud checklist so that everyone who handles transaction or deals with the key transactions just passes through that checklist to ensure that the controls or whatever is required in that checklist is actually in place. Then we have awareness and training with our vendors, with our partners, and we include this even in contracts with partners and suppliers. On the closest we really want on anti-corruption and fraud to have covered within our relationship. And then we optimize the use of technology because it is easier actually to deal with these cases when we actually have our transactions or most of our operations being handled through technology. We have a fraud hotline as the 6th step, whereby we encourage and we disseminate to all the people we deal with and in our website a hotline where people can report cases of fraud. And then lastly, we have created a hot banner effect. You know, before if someone was involved in fraud cases, for instance, if it is financial in nature, they will happily go away, maybe if the punishment is only being sacked or terminated. But now we follow up to ensure that we disseminate that name to all organizations that we deal with so that the person may not do the same. We also try to follow up for recovery so that the person does not just go with the money and so forth. We have some steps so that we make it feel hot when you want to participate. It has a hot banner effect in case someone is thinking of engaging in fraud. So those are the outlines of the 7 steps that.
Terrific. Thank you very much, Patroba. I hope that we'll be able to come back to have a bit of final Q&A just at the end of the session. But for now, I'm going to move back over to Jeremy. So, Jeremy, you mentioned at the beginning some of the issues for risk management, and Patroba has now highlighted a number of challenges faced in practice for humanitarian organizations. What can we do to meet these challenges and improve risk management in the sector? Back to you, Jeremy.
Yes, thanks for that, Inherit, and thanks as well, Patroba. I think we heard some very excellent examples on a very practical level of what it looks like to implement risk management well in the field and some of the challenges that go along with that. So I wanted to take a minute just to highlight really re-highlight a couple of the points that Patroba mentioned and then share a couple of additional points from the global perspective too. So I think there is this fundamental question of, given the existing knowledge and tools, why are we not better at managing risk? There are in fact a lot of tools that exist out there, and we know based on the context in which we work as humanitarians that there is risk. So why are we not better at it? I think Patroba highlighted or narrowed in on a couple of factors here, I think, linked to the points I have on the screen as well. So one, perhaps easy is the wrong word, but it's we do tend to focus on the technical aspects of risk management and then overlook the need to embed risk management into the culture of the organization. I think it's the point that Patroba raised around enterprise risk management versus risk management is important to understand, which gets in the need to look into the culture of the organization, and along with that, the role that all staff play in identifying and managing risk. It's not just someone with risk in their title. It's a role that all of us working in an organization committed to risk management need to understand if we want to be successful in risk management. And then 3 key areas in terms of action steps I wanted to touch upon as well. So one, again, I think we heard a lot of this in what Patroba shared about the World Vision Somalia experience. So how do we better embed risk management into organizational culture? Certainly the tone at the top is key. That's a phrase that you hear a lot when it comes to risk management. Certainly those with an audit background recognize this as well. So the tone at the top, the degree to which the senior top management in the organization really sets the tone for how risk management are going to be embedded into the work. And that should not be underestimated, the degree to which the tone at the top or how well the senior leadership is really committed to this process affects the ability of the organization to do it well. So tone at the top, critical. Again, everyone has a role to play. So I think part of embedding risk management into organizational culture, to be careful how we link different aspects of risk management into human resource accountabilities. So the degree to which individual job descriptions, our performance appraisals, how we're assessed and how we do our work, also involves a degree of assessment with regard to how well we're embedding risk management thinking, the concept of enterprise risk management into our tasks. And then finally, I think a point there on managing technical tools to key decision points. So not just that we have a good risk management system, but how well are we actually using the outputs of that to guide our strategic planning? So maybe back to the question of thinking about risk appetite and risk tolerance. Are we considering those when we do our longer-term strategic planning? When it comes to our program and project implementation, so for example, setting up our monitoring and evaluation systems well, like we discussed earlier, do we link that into our assessment of risk, our risk matrix, our controls as well, and link how we think about those areas? And then finally, when we think about our funding stream and the go, no-go decision, again, are we thinking about our risk appetite and risk tolerance when we consider our ability to take on new funding from particular donors and work in specific contexts? So I think all of those key to thinking about how we embed risk management in organizational culture. A second point, action step-wise, I think about increasing collective sharing. And what I mean by that is largely what we're doing today. I think there can be a tendency to not do a lot of public sharing between or cross-sharing between organizations when it comes to specifics on how we're handling risk, what are the challenges, etc. So I think it's good that we increase the space that we have to share experience around how we manage risk well, like we've heard from Patroba today. And also make materials more accessible to non-technical staff. Again, risk management doesn't just fall on the shoulders of those with risk in their title who have expert backgrounds. Essentially, it should be part of all of our work when it comes to how we carry forward the objectives of our organization. So it's important to make materials more accessible to a broader range of staff. And also support multiple approaches. I think there's many of us working on how to carry forward better risk management in the humanitarian space. So how can we make that more of a collective effort as opposed to individual efforts? Finally, I just wanted to circle back to the point I shared earlier about zero tolerance risk. I think there's a big need to reframe what we mean by zero tolerance. And I think a couple of points to consider here, and be happy to touch back on these in the Q&A discussion afterwards too. So I think good to reframe what we mean by zero tolerance, being a zero tolerance for a lack of policies, guidelines, tools, or systems to effectively manage risk, not a zero tolerance for incidents. Incidents we know will happen, so how can we focus on having a zero tolerance for not managing risk well? And then again, along with that, we shift the thinking from zero tolerance from counting of incidents to implementation of proactive risk management. So when we look at our performance, it's not just counting incidents. We consider performance in terms of are we actually being proactive in our risk management approach. So a couple of really points I wanted to raise in terms of food for thought when we get into our Q&A session. And then finally, before I wrap up, just to cover briefly who's working on risk in the humanitarian space. Again, this is not an exhaustive list. There are lots of ongoing efforts, but I wanted to highlight a few here. One, for those not aware, Interaction Network in the U.S. has really done some excellent work focused on risk management, both in 2016 and actually earlier in 2019. Along with humanitarian outcomes. So an earlier piece around how international humanitarian actors manage uncertainty. And then earlier this year, really an excellent series looking at NGOs and risk management and how there's risk transfer through local and international partnerships. And that included a number of detailed case studies at the country level, so that's really a good resource to look at. Again, as I shared earlier, we're starting a briefing series for ICVA, so please follow along with that briefing series as well. That can be accessed via the ICVA website and also building towards our annual conference in 2020. And then a couple of other resources I think may be good to highlight. So EISF, I believe they just go by their acronym now, but they're a network of NGOs focused on security focal points based in Europe, but now focused more globally. They've got a very good resource on security risk management, particularly focused on smaller NGOs, so a great resource to look at. ODI, Humanitarian Policy Group as well, has a number of resources available on risk management, but there's a good one back from 2011 on risk and humanitarian action towards a common approach. I think interesting in that date, 2011, to realize we've been pushing for a long time. So I think, again, how can we leverage more action with a collective discussion going forward here? And then finally, we've already talked about ISO 31000, which is the main organization identifying standards for risk management. I like to highlight CASO. It has a funny name, Committee of Sponsoring Organizations of the Federal Commission. That's not important. COSO is important. CASO really is the organization that is framing risk management, enterprise risk management well. I think this is a great resource to look at from the humanitarian perspective to get a better idea of how we push risk management beyond technical and into the enterprise risk management space that cuts across all areas of an organization. So the causal work really was initially created in the U.S. to handle corporate fraud, but I think is really highly relevant in many ways to some of the work that we handle as humanitarians as well. So I'd encourage people to look at that resource if you're interested. Great. I think that's it on this session, so pause and back to you, Inherit.
Fantastic. Thanks a lot, Jeremy. Yes, good news. We do have a few minutes for questions, so this is excellent. First one, over to Jeremy. This is a question from Jacques in the Philippines. Jacques is coming back to, as he says, the interesting points from Jeremy about zero tolerance. And essentially, he's wondering, is it appropriate to actually push back on this idea of zero tolerance for all types of risk? And Jacques is thinking in particular about the kind of risk that humanitarian professionals themselves pose to the people we help. For example, child sexual abuse and exploitation. If zero tolerance is not appropriate in this context, what level of risk is acceptable when it comes to this type of risk? A challenging question. Over to you, Jeremy.
Yeah, I think a very challenging question, and certainly it can be true that an aspirational goal with certain types of really traumatic and horrific specific areas of risk, like you mentioned, sexual exploitation and abuse, right? There is no acceptable level. Despite the fact that we can agree that there's no acceptable level, incidents can and will happen. So I think it can be important, and this would be true in some areas more than others, to make sure that you keep both sides in mind. So incidents, no matter our desire to prevent them, will in fact happen sooner or later. So we need to remember that it's not just about focusing on the incidents, but critically important that we have a zero tolerance for the correct procedures in place. So if we're just focused on zero tolerance for those type of incidents and forget about all of the systems and policies, good controls in place that are necessary to have in place to be proactive and prevent those type of things from happening, I think that can be a problem. So I think it's a great point. Certainly we don't want to see certain types of risk like that occurring, particularly in the area of SEA. However, we need to keep a focus on the broader piece of how to be proactive as well and prevent that from happening. And I think we have a good focus on risk management and a zero tolerance approach to lack of risk management. That's where you're most able to be proactive and prevent those incidents from occurring.
Great, thank you, Jeremy. I now have a question from DIA, calling in from Senegal, and I'll pose this first to Patroba and then Jeremy if you want to jump in as well. The question is, can we also share a few best practices related to risk transfer to local partners with less resources? How can INGOs support these local partners to ensure that they can manage risk properly? Over to you, Patroba, for best practices.
Good. That's a very good question, because I can say that the work we've done in terms of transferring risk to local partners is quite comprehensive. And I must say that the first step is to be deliberate about it, that you want to build the capacity of these partners, because they help you reach areas that you otherwise cannot reach, and therefore achieve your objectives. So the first step is we do capacity assessments, ensure that we are aware of their capacity, and then we work with them. We invest a lot in working with them. I remember one of the partners that I spent 1 week there just trying to capacity build them on ERM, and by the end of the session, they were actually changing their vision and mission, and some of these things they didn't even have, because when they understood DRM and what it is, they actually set up to overhaul the organization. And these ones are actually now attracting a great deal of funding directly from the donors, because when we do raise their capacity, then they demonstrate their ability to deal with the risks that occur in their operations, and therefore we are able to use them more as our partners, and therefore be able to achieve more.
Okay, thanks a lot, Patroba. And over to you, Jeremy, on this question.
Sure, I think I can just add a couple of points in addition to what Patroba said. Certainly, I think the degree to which INGOs are doing a good job of upfront risk assessment to help frame funding agreements, I think can be a big help, because if there's good work done before a funding agreement is put in place to do the risk assessment properly, help that frame the agreement, there's more of an ability to build into the agreement the need to support local partners as well, and not have it come up as just an after-the-fact need. So I think be proactive upfront when creating a funding agreement, important step. Certainly a step around sharing resources. So in addition to capacity building, as Patroba mentioned, I think when it comes to certain risk areas like staff care, security, etc., possibly to consider how different resources available to the INGO can be shared with local partners as well. So I think another key one to look at there. And then again, I mentioned already the case study work done by Interaction exactly on this question of how transfer of risk occurs between INGOs and national NGOs, and some of the recommendations for how to improve that type of transfer. I really would suggest looking at some of the specific case studies that Interaction
great, thank you for that, Jeremy. Another question that can go to both of you, first Patroba, then Jeremy. This is regarding standards in risk management. Mohammed in Turkey is asking if there are any common basic standards for risk management in humanitarian action. You've both today mentioned ISO 31000, for example. To what extent is this accepted as the standard followed by humanitarian organizations? And are there any other standards that are important to keep in mind? First to you, Patroba.
Yes, Jeremy mentioned the American COSO framework, which is another standard I'm aware of. And these two, the ISO 31000 and American COSO framework, are the most commonly used. And they just have a difference in approach. But basically, I believe the focus, the ERM work is can basically be achieved through both. Then we have the IRM standard. The Institute of Risk Management has their own standard, and I'm also aware of the British standard. It's 31100 of 2011. So those are the standards that I think I'm aware of when it comes to
Okay, very good, thank you. And Jeremy, anything to add or any reflections on the extent to which these standards are followed by humanitarian organizations?
Yeah, I think Patroba got it right. Those really are the standards that are out there. I think as with anything, they're designed to be standards, but I think also important to reflect a little bit on your organization mission objective, particular context in which you work, and which of these might be most relevant to your particular organizational objective, structure, etc. So I think those are the ones to look at, but also good to become familiar with them and think through how they might align with your particular organization.
Okay, very good. We have time for one more question. This is for you, Patroba. It's coming in from Louisa in the United States, asking, how do you support risk management along local supply chains and third parties, in addition to staff? Over to you, Patroba.
Good. Okay, when it comes to what we do is actually our risk management system is actually bottom up. So all the assessments, risk identifications, they start from the ground, from the field where we operate, and we do have every department coming up with processes and then coming up with the risk. So what happens when it comes to the local supply chain? They come up with their risk, and there is a local committee that deals with the top ones. So the supply chain risk will be handled first at that level, and then we also have the central committee that looks at all the risks that have been raised for the sake of prioritization of the top 10 or the top 10 for the office. So this system allows us to go down to the local supply chain. When it comes to third parties, and probably I can talk of our partners, we do have training, and this is inclusive of policy design. We do consultation on policy design for free for our partners, and we also do encourage them to have the systems. And for our suppliers, we have meetings deliberately to address risks that they may be facing when dealing with our local supply chain and so forth. One of the challenges, though, is when it comes to fragile context and supply chain, we miss the regulation bit. Most of the time, we end up having to do some major supplies outside the context because of the regulatory position when dealing with things like pharmaceuticals and so forth. So these are actually flagged out during the risk management process, and therefore dealt with at that level.
Very good, thank you. So we're nearing the end of our time. I'd like to thank you very much, Patroba, for sharing your experience, deep experience, and all of these concrete examples with us. Also, Jeremy as co-host, but also providing us with a lot of incredibly useful background, particularly as you're launching at ICVA this series on risk management and humanitarian action. Before we wrap up, I would like to ask both of you, first Jeremy and Patroba, following the discussion today, the presentations, and in particular the inputs and the questions from the participants, do you have any final remarks, any reflections that you would like to leave with us today? So first, over to you, Jeremy.
Yeah, thanks, Inherit, and certainly to all of the participants for the great questions. I think just based on some of the questions that we've heard today, there really is an interest in digging into this topic of risk management, and I think linking it better to the work. So I think the questions were quite helpful for me to hear. I would encourage people to continue to reach out if there are particular areas of risk management that would be helpful to highlight. I know we had some interest around the zero tolerance question that I'm interested to explore more. So from my end, I really hope this was a good starting point. Again, one of the challenges is that risk is a very broad area. It can also be seen as a technical area. So how can we package the discussion on risk management in a way that's more accessible to a broader range of people? And hopefully the end result is we're better able to embed it into the culture of how we work, which again, I think from my perspective, important to remember that this is not done as some sort of compliance exercise, but really, or upward-looking compliance exercise, I should say, but really done in the interest of being better organizations and putting ourselves in a place to better serve the people that we exist to serve as humanitarians. So I'm excited to carry forward the risk management series that we're engaging on with ICVA, so please feel free to, I encourage you to track that as we move forward towards our conference next year. And don't hesitate to be in touch as well if there are ways in which you would like to, or areas you'd like to see us focus on specifically.
Okay, thanks a lot, Jeremy. And over to you, Patroba, for any final remarks that you'd like to share with the group today.
Yeah, what I would like to say is that from my experience in ERM in Somalia, I find this as a system of documenting process and analyzing our risks and documenting decisions, because previously probably the decisions would be on an email or a meeting minutes of a meeting and so forth. But you will probably not realize the benefits of ERM, or rather the achievement of objectives via ERM until you do it, because we've really experienced a lot, and it's easy to just go back to our risk registers year after year and see what decisions have been supported by the ERM and by the ERM process. And I can say that it's really encouraging that this risk management series have been started, and I'm looking forward to having this series, because from the questions I believe we really have some and I think I can say we some knowledge dissemination need and also some awareness creation. And thank you so much for creating this forum, because I believe it is a start of big things.
And thank you, Patroba, for all of your help today. Very much appreciated. So now, wrapping things up, I'd like to highlight that the recording of today's event, both in full video format and in audio-only podcast format, will be available on the event page in the coming days, and you'll receive the link to that in the follow-up email, everyone who registered for today's event. And just to remind you, as has been mentioned several times, this is the starting point for the ICVA Risk Management Series, and we look forward to being able to circulate more information also via email once that is available, which should be quite soon. Then looking ahead to the online event calendar at PHAP, I'd also like to briefly mention the third event in our series with the Global Protection Cluster, the GPC, that's taking place next week on the 26th of November, the topic being coordination and collaboration with the Global Protection Cluster. If of interest, please do click to read more and to register for that event. We hope to see you online again soon, either next week or in another upcoming webinar on another topic. So with that, I'd like to thank everyone, once again, our guest Patroba, my co-host Jeremy, to all of the participants for a very interesting discussion and clearly the beginning of a very useful series. And I'll pass the virtual floor back over to you, Jeremy, if you'd like to say any final words.
I think really not much final to add on my end, but I think thanks again to Patroba for joining. I think, again, one of the interesting pieces is to be able to link some of the global discussion we have with some very practical examples from what it looks like to do this in real life. So I really want to thank Patroba for being willing to share some of the experience in World Vision Somalia. And I really look forward to continuing the discussion.
Thank you, Jeremy. And with that, this is the team from PHAP signing off from Geneva. Thank you all very much, and looking forward to next time. Bye-bye.